A homeless veteran stood silently before the judge, facing charges no one cared to question. But when the judge heard him whisper a single name, the courtroom froze. What followed was a shocking uncovering of betrayal, sacrifice, and forgotten honor. This was not just another trial, it was a battle for truth buried by time. And when the full story came to light, even the coldest hearts could not remain seated. Before we begin, subscribe to Epic Story Moments and turn on the bell. Like, share, and comment to help us keep sharing powerful stories. Let us know where you're watching from. Thomas Rayner sat hunched on the stone bench just outside the county courthouse. His coat, worn thin by the seasons, barely shielded him from the biting wind. In his late 60s, Thomas was a fixture in the small Midwestern town, a quiet, nearly invisible presence. Most residents passed by without a glance. They knew who he was but pretended not to. The man with the weathered face, unkempt beard, and eyes that seemed to carry decades of weight. Children whispered about him, adults crossed the street. The courthouse itself stood like a pillar in the town, white-bricked, proud, and orderly. Inside, Judge Emily Carter presided. Known for her precision, she moved through each case with measured calm. Her chambers were neat, her words deliberate. She held the law in high regard and emotion at a distance. Though respected, few truly knew her. Two lives ran in parallel. One structured and praised, the other forgotten and judged. On an early April morning, those lives finally collided. Thomas had been arrested for trespassing and resisting arrest near the courthouse gates. No one knew why he had been there. Not even Thomas, it seemed. The courtroom buzzed faintly as Thomas was led in, hands cuffed loosely, shuffling in worn-out boots. Officer Daniels, a young patrolman, stood nearby, uneasy. Just the night before, Thomas had been found pacing near the iron gates, muttering and shouting at no one in particular. Daniels remembered how Thomas had resisted only with words, not actions. Names spilled from his mouth, names that meant nothing to the officers. The prosecutor barely looked up from his files. He recommended sentencing without delay. Repeat warnings, multiple disturbances, and clear signs of vagrancy, he said flatly. The public defender assigned to Thomas sighed, flipping through a thin folder. To him, this was just another lost man with another petty charge. But Judge Carter paused. Her eyes lingered on a note buried deep in the file. Commendation, U.S. Army. Most of the military record was blacked out, heavily redacted. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. Something did not add up. She glanced at Thomas, who stared blankly at the floor, hands trembling slightly. When asked to speak, Thomas barely raised his head. His voice was soft, almost broken. "Not guilty," he murmured, then fell silent. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Rayner, do you understand the charges?" Thomas mumbled something again, just one name this time: Collins. Major Collins. The name caught Judge Carter's attention. She looked back at the file. There was no mention of anyone by that name. But something in the way Thomas said it, tired, aching, yet steady, made her hesitate. She instructed the court clerk to initiate an unsealing request for his military records. "Mr. Rayner," she asked more gently this time, "why were you at the courthouse gate yesterday?" His eyes, until now dulled by time and pain, flickered with emotion. A single tear slid down his cheek. "I had to keep a promise," he whispered. The courtroom fell silent. No one moved. Carter nodded slowly. "This hearing is adjourned for today." As she stood, she leaned close to her clerk and said quietly, "Find everything you can on his service record. I want the full truth." Outside, the wind howled through the streets, but inside the courthouse, something had begun to stir, an unraveling of silence, and the beginning of a story long buried. Judge Carter sat in her chambers long after sunset, eyes fixed on the dimly lit documents spread across her desk. The military file on Thomas Rainer, once heavily redacted, had begun to take shape. Among the scattered pages was a Bronze Star citation, half of it blacked out under national security seals. What little she could read chilled her. Thomas had served in a covert unit during the Gulf War. The details were scarce, but one mission had gone catastrophically wrong. Dozens killed. Only 2 men made it back, Thomas and another officer whose name was still withheld. The commendation noted bravery under fire, but then the record took a sharp turn. Thomas had been dishonorably discharged. The reason? Insubordination. Refusal to cooperate in the post-operation inquiry. It did not make sense. Carter leaned back, piecing together the contradiction. A hero, punished? His refusal to lie about the mission had cost him his career, his benefits, and ultimately, his family. Reading on, she found a note scrawled in a margin. Objected to falsified reports, refused to sign. Her hand trembled slightly as she closed the file. She had sentenced hundreds, each time trusting the system. But for the first time, she felt it, doubt. The next morning, Officer Daniels knocked on Carter's chamber door. He looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot. She invited him in. "I need to say something about that man, Rainer," he began, voice quiet. "When I arrested him, he kept repeating something. Not before April 16th. I thought he was just confused." Carter froze. "April 16th, she repeated slowly. Daniels nodded. "It was not random. He begged us, said we could take him after, just not before that day. I thought it was nonsense. But now, I am not so sure." Later that day, Carter received an unexpected call from someone asking for her directly. Rebecca Collins, daughter of Major James Collins, the same name Thomas had whispered in court. She had seen the court bulletin online. "My father served with Thomas," she said. "Before he died, he asked me to find him one day. He said if the world forgot Thomas Rainer, then we had failed the best man in our unit." She arrived that afternoon, carrying a sealed letter from her father. Rebecca looked Carter in the eye. "He said Thomas saved them all." In a hastily called recess, Judge Carter confronted the prosecutor. "We are not moving forward until we understand exactly who Thomas Rainer is," she stated, her voice steadier than it had been in days. She requested an emergency session with a military liaison. Meanwhile, Rebecca handed Carter her father's final letter. It was yellowed, worn at the edges, but untouched in truth. The letter described the mission, the ambush, the chaos, the silence from command. Major Collins wrote that Thomas disobeyed a direct order to retreat, instead organizing a defense that saved the entire surviving unit. His actions directly contradicted the official account. And then came the heart of it. The dishonorable discharge had been a political shield meant to deflect blame away from command decisions that had led to the failed mission. Thomas had become the scapegoat. Carter's heart sank. All the years, the pain, the loss, all rooted in silence. The biggest shock came when Rebecca spoke quietly. "Do you know what day it was?" "April 16th, Carter said. "Yes. Every year, he returns to the courthouse. That was the day he made it out. The day they did not. He keeps vigil for them, always alone." Judge Carter looked at the bench where Thomas had always sat, invisible to the world. She suddenly saw not a homeless man, but a soldier still standing guard over his fallen brothers. And the court? They had nearly locked him away for it. The courtroom was full when the hearing resumed. Word had spread, though quietly, that something unusual was unfolding. Judge Carter entered without her usual briskness. She held a paper in her hand, Major Collins' letter, and beside it, the unsealed citation for Thomas Rainer's Bronze Star. She cleared her throat. "Before this court proceeds, I will read a document into the record." Her voice remained calm, but with every word she spoke, the room leaned in closer. She recited the account of Thomas Rainer's stand, 18 hours alone, pinned under fire, holding the line so his unit could retreat. An act that had prevented a massacre and potentially a far-reaching international incident. Silence fell when she finished. The prosecutor stood slowly. "In light of this information, "The state withdraws all charges," he said. His voice lacked conviction, but not understanding. Carter nodded. "So ordered." And then it happened. A man in the back row, old, with a silver pin on his lapel, stood and saluted. One by one, others followed. Veterans, court officers, even strangers. A quiet rising, a gesture more powerful than words. Thomas sat stunned. No one had ever stood for him before. For a long moment, Thomas could not move. His shoulders, always curled inward with shame, now shook under a different weight. He lowered his head and wept. After the courtroom cleared, Judge Carter invited him to her chambers. He stepped inside hesitantly, unsure of what came next. She gestured for him to sit. "I believe your record should be cleared," she said plainly. "Not just this case, but all of it. You deserve your honor back." Thomas looked down. "What happens to the ones who did this?" he asked quietly. "That is not your burden," she replied. He nodded slowly. "I will agree, but only if no one else is punished for telling the truth too late. Let it stop with me." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the soldier, but the man who had carried pain with grace. With his permission, she began the paperwork, petitions for expungement, inquiries with the Department of Veterans Affairs. She reached out to contacts she had not spoken to in years. Quietly, steadily, the wheels began to turn. Carter worked through weekends, while Daniels brought her coffee and helped navigate military bureaucracy. Together, they traced denied applications, housing assistance, healthcare, disability support, all blocked due to Thomas's discharge status. They found a letter from 10 years ago, in which Thomas had pleaded for help, only to be dismissed without review. It was clear now, he had never stopped trying. Then came the article. A local journalist, tipped off by someone in the courtroom, published the story. The veteran who was left behind. It spread quietly at first, shared by veterans groups, discussed in town halls. Carter worried the media attention might complicate the legal process. But Thomas surprised her again. He agreed to a brief interview, standing beside the memorial downtown. "I do not want recognition," he said into the camera. "I just want to thank the families of those who did not make it back. They are the real heroes." The clip went viral overnight. Veterans across the country began calling for his name to be restored. Now, the court was preparing not for a trial, but for a moment of reckoning. A ruling that would either correct decades of injustice or leave a wound open forever. The stage was set, and for the first time in years, Thomas Rayner stood tall. The courtroom was overflowing. Veterans, town residents, journalists, faces that had once turned away from Thomas Rayner now leaned forward with quiet anticipation. Judge Carter entered, not with her usual firm steps, but with deliberate, measured grace. She cleared her throat and began. "It is the ruling of this court that Mr. Thomas Rayner's record shall be fully restored. His military discharge is hereby amended to reflect honorable service. His commendations, including the Bronze Star, are officially reinstated." A collective breath filled the room. Carter continued, announcing that the Department of Veterans Affairs had approved full housing, healthcare, and pension benefits. She then stepped down from the bench, a rare move, and approached Thomas. In her hand was a velvet box and a sealed envelope. "This is yours," she said, handing him the restored medal. "And this is from the Department of Defense." Thomas's hands trembled. His voice barely carried as he whispered, "I did not do it for medals. I did it for them." His gaze rose, not to the ceiling, but toward something unseen. The room remained silent, not out of protocol, but reverence. Judge Carter returned to the bench and spoke softly, yet with weight in every word. "Justice is not merely a matter of laws and rulings. It is the recognition of dignity, sacrifice, and truth. Thomas Rayner was failed by a system that should have honored him. Today, we begin to make that right, not by favor, but by principle." She paused, scanning the faces in the room. Redemption is not granted by law alone. It is offered by people willing to listen. Officer Daniel stood nearby, now in uniform, holding a folder. He later announced a new town initiative, a mentorship and aid program for overlooked veterans. It would be named Rainer House. Rebecca stepped forward and embraced Thomas, her eyes full of tears. "You gave me back my father," she whispered. "I will never let them forget you." Then, without prompting, the courtroom rose. Not as before. This time, it was not out of duty or tradition. It was something deeper, a collective acknowledgement, a town standing up not just for a man, but for what he represented. Weeks later, the same courthouse steps saw a familiar figure, but he looked entirely different. Thomas Rainer now sat with his back straight, wearing a simple gray suit and polished shoes. In his lap was a bundle of handwritten letters, drawings, thank you notes, and messages from children who had heard his story in school. Beside him was a newly installed plaque, framed in bronze. It read, "In honor of those who served without recognition. May we never overlook courage again." Judge Carter watched from her chambers above. She had read every letter submitted in the days after the ruling. Some came from other veterans, some from children, and others from people who simply said, "Thank you for reminding us to care." Thomas looked up at her window and gave a small nod, not of gratitude, but of shared understanding. Then he stood, tucked the letters under his arm, and walked down the street, not with a limp or hesitation, but with steady, measured purpose. Final line. He came seeking justice, and reminded a town of its humanity.